The glass slipped from his hand in slow motion. Ice cubes clinked against porcelain tiles, soda splashed across fabric, and gasps rose from the tables nearby. For a split second, the world inside that pristine dining room froze. Forks halted mid-air, conversations cut short, even the hum of background music seemed to dim. All eyes shifted toward one woman, Angela Davis. She sat by the counter, waiting quietly for the takeout order she had placed nearly half an hour ago. Her blouse, once crisp and white, now clung damply to her frame, stained by a sticky caramel hue that spread like an uninvited shadow across her chest. The scent of soda mixed sharply with citrus cleaning supplies, filling her nose as she tried to steady her breath. Her hands trembled, not from the cold drink soaking through the fabric, but from the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. Angela wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. That wasn't her way. She had asked politely why her order seemed to take so long when others, customers who had walked in after her, were served with smiles and efficiency. She had smiled softly, careful not to sound confrontational. But Richard Coleman, the manager, stood on the other side of the counter with a smirk curling his lips. His impatience was thinly veiled, his disdain barely concealed. And when she spoke, when she dared to question what was happening, he made his choice. With deliberate calm, he tipped the cup in his hand and let it spill over her. The staff flinched, caught between instinct and fear. One young waiter's hand twitched toward a towel before he pulled it back quickly, eyes darting nervously to Richard. The room shifted uncomfortably. Some customers averted their gaze, staring into their plates as though nothing had happened, while others whispered behind their hands. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was sharp, heavy, suffocating. Angela sat perfectly still. Years of navigating spaces where she wasn't always welcomed, where her presence was judged before her words, had taught her the cruel art of restraint. "Don't give them more reason," her mind whispered. "Don't let them think you're the problem." So she breathed deeply, folded her shaking hands in her lap, and said nothing. Richard chuckled under his breath, straightening his tie as though he had just proven some unspoken point. To him, she wasn't a customer to be respected. She was a target he could dismiss without consequence. The sight of her stained blouse, her quiet dignity, seemed only to feed his arrogance. In the corner of the restaurant, an older couple exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes reflecting the question no one dared ask aloud. How far was this going to go? The clock above the counter ticked louder in Angela's ears. Each second stretched longer than the last. Her heart pounded, not just from the sting of humiliation, but from the ache of knowing no one, not a single soul, was stepping in. And just when it seemed she would be forced to swallow this cruelty in silence, the soft sound of a door opening shifted the air. The bell above the entrance jingled gently, breaking the frozen moment. A man stepped inside, his face carrying a smile meant for her, a warmth that reached across the room. Angela looked up, her breath catching. It was David, her husband. And in that instant, as his eyes found her soaked blouse and trembling hands, his smile faded. The story was about to change. David's shoes clicked softly against the polished floor as he stepped inside, his presence quiet but commanding. He carried no entourage, no signal of status, just a simple leather jacket over his shirt, and the easy smile of a man who had come to surprise his wife after a long day. But that smile faltered the moment he saw her. Angela sat stiffly by the counter, her blouse drenched, her shoulders pulled inward as if to shield herself from invisible blows. The soda stain spread down her side, sticky and dark, and though her face was calm, David knew her well enough to see the tremor in her hands, the way she pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. He froze. The room, already tense, seemed to grow heavier with his stillness. Customers shifted in their chairs, their gazes flickering between Angela, the arrogant man behind the counter, and the tall figure who had just entered. David's chest tightened. He didn't know what had happened yet, but he could feel it. The disrespect, the cruelty that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. He set down the small bouquet he had been carrying, meant to brighten her evening, and walked slowly toward her. His steps were measured, but each one carried a weight that drew every pair of eyes in the room. Angela turned slightly, meeting his gaze. She wanted to smile, to reassure him, but the words caught in her throat. For all her strength, For all the years she had taught herself how to endure indignity and silence, in this moment her composure cracked. The sight of him, steady, unshaken, hers, unlocked the tears she had been holding back. David's brow furrowed, his voice quiet as he asked, "Angela, what happened?" Richard Coleman stood tall behind the counter, arms crossed, his smirk returning like armor. He leaned forward, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, his tone laced with mockery. "What happened? She got impatient, started acting like she's owed something. So I reminded her where she stands." He gestured toward Angela with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Maybe next time she'll think twice before wasting my time." The words sliced through the air. Some customers gasped softly, others looked down at their plates, pretending not to hear. The staff exchanged helpless glances, their fear holding them hostage in silence. Angela lowered her gaze, her hands clutching the damp napkin she had been using to dab at her blouse. The humiliation deepened, not because of the soda, but because her dignity was being torn apart publicly, piece by piece. She wanted to vanish, to fold herself into nothingness so no one could witness her pain. But David did not move. He did not shout, did not bristle with rage. Instead, he inhaled slowly, grounding himself. Then, with quiet grace, he shrugged off his leather jacket and draped it gently over Angela's shoulders. The gesture was small, tender, yet it rippled through the room like thunder. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, clutching the lapels of his jacket. The warmth of it, the weight of it, reminded her she wasn't alone. For the first time since the cup had spilled over her, she could breathe. Richard scoffed. "Cute," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But if you've got a problem, you can take it outside. I run this place, and I won't be disrespected by some—" He stopped mid-sentence, sneering, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. Because David was no ordinary husband defending his wife. He was the one man Richard should never have crossed. And the room was seconds away from finding out why. The manager's laughter hung in the air, harsh and careless, as though the man standing before him was just another inconvenience to swat away. Richard Coleman leaned back against the counter, his chin lifted, his smirk daring David to make a scene. He had the confidence of someone who believed he owned the room, who thought his position was unshakable. But David Davis didn't move in haste. He stood steady, his hands resting calmly at his sides, the kind of composure that came not from weakness, but from deep, unshakable strength. He had built his life on understanding people, on reading rooms, on never needing to raise his voice to command attention. And now, with his wife's blouse stained and her dignity trampled, he felt the weight of silence pressing against his chest. Angela sat still, her shoulders wrapped in his jacket. Her eyes were lowered, not because she was broken, but because she didn't want to fall apart in front of a crowd of strangers. She had swallowed humiliation before. She knew its bitter taste. But something in David's presence told her this moment would not end like all the others. He lifted his gaze to Richard, his voice quiet but steady. "You poured a drink on my wife." Richard scoffed, waving a hand. "She was being difficult. If she can't handle a little mess, maybe she should go somewhere else. My restaurant doesn't need people like her wasting space." The words echoed, crude and cutting. Customers stiffened, their forks frozen in midair, their eyes darting between the man behind the counter and the one standing firm in the middle of the room. Even the staff, who had seen Richard's arrogance 100 times before, seemed startled at the boldness of his cruelty. David's expression didn't change. He bent slightly, brushing a strand of hair away from Angela's cheek, an intimate gesture that spoke volumes. She closed her eyes at his touch, finding steadiness in the simple reminder. He saw her, he was here, and she was not alone. When he stood upright again, his voice was low, almost too calm. "Tell me," he said to Richard. "Do you know who I am?" Richard barked a laugh. "Should I? You think I care? Some guy playing hero because his girlfriend had a bad day? Save it. This is my restaurant. I decide how things are run here." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd, the sheer arrogance, the blindness of his words. One of the waiters near the kitchen door bit his lip, his face pale, as though he knew something Richard clearly didn't. David let the silence stretch, his gaze never leaving the manager. Then, with the same calm clarity he used in boardrooms filled with executives, he said, "No, you don't run this restaurant. You work here, and the person who does run it is me." The words struck like lightning. The dining room gasped as though the very air had been pulled out of their lungs. Customers exchanged stunned looks, whispers spilling across tables like ripples on water. The staff froze, their eyes widening, every one of them suddenly understanding the gravity of what was unfolding. Richard's smirk faltered. His face drained of color as his confidence cracked, replaced by confusion that quickly bled into dread. "You... what?" he stammered, his voice trembling in a way no one had ever heard from him before. David didn't flinch. He took a slow step closer, his presence filling the room not with volume, but with certainty. "David Davis," he said evenly, "CEO of this restaurant chain, the man who signs your paychecks, and the husband of the woman you just humiliated." A hush fell so deep it was deafening. Every eye in the room turned to Richard, watching his arrogance unravel before their very eyes. His jaw worked as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. For the first time in years, he was powerless. Angela lifted her gaze, watching as the man who had mocked her shrank before her husband's truth. The weight that had pressed on her chest began to ease, not because of vengeance, but because dignity, her dignity, was finally being restored. And as David's words settled into the silence, everyone in that restaurant knew nothing would ever be the same for Richard Coleman. His jaw twitched as he scrambled for words, for excuses, for anything that could claw him back from the edge he had just stepped over. The arrogance that once gleamed in his eyes now flickered with panic. His gaze darted around the restaurant, searching for an ally among the staff or customers. But every face had shifted. Where there had been fear of him, there was now only judgment. David stood unwavering, his calm presence casting a shadow over Richard's unraveling. The silence was thick, the kind of silence that carried its own weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, but it reached every corner of the room. "You thought you could strip away her dignity in front of strangers," David said quietly. "You thought no one would stop you because you hold the title of manager. But what you don't understand is that power isn't in your position. It's in how you treat people. And right now, everyone here has seen the truth of who you are." Richard's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, forcing a nervous laugh. "Look, it was a joke. She took it the wrong way. I didn't mean anything by it. These people..." He gestured weakly toward the tables. "They're blowing this out of proportion." But the weak protest only deepened the silence. No one moved. No one nodded in his defense. A mother at the corner table pulled her child a little closer, her expression cold. A young waiter stood straighter, his fear dissolving into a quiet kind of hope. The spell of Richard's authority had been broken, and he knew it. David took another step forward, his tone unshaken. "When you poured that soda, you weren't just spilling a drink. You were spilling your contempt. You humiliated a customer, and worse, you humiliated my wife. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And choices have consequences." Angela's eyes glistened as she watched her husband speak, his words wrapping around her like a shield. For so long, she had carried moments like this alone, the small, sharp cuts of prejudice endured in silence. But now, her pain was being named out loud, held up for all to see. Richard raised his palms, as if bargaining for mercy. "Mr. Davis, if I'd known she was your wife, I never..." The instant the words left his mouth, the damage was sealed. Customers audibly gasped, some shaking their heads in disgust. Because in that slip, Richard revealed the heart of his prejudice. He wasn't sorry for what he had done, only sorry for who he had done it to. David's jaw tightened. He leaned in just slightly, enough that his words cut sharp and clear. "If she hadn't been my wife, you think that would have made it acceptable?" His voice dropped to a near whisper, the kind of whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "Respect is not conditional. And if you can't see that, you have no place here." The finality in his tone was unmistakable. Richard stammered, "Wait, sir, please let me explain." But David didn't let him finish. With the calm of a man who had made his decision long before the plea was spoken, he said, "You're fired. Effective immediately." The words cracked through the restaurant like a gavel striking wood. Gasps erupted, followed by a stunned hush. Richard staggered back a step, his face pale, his authority stripped away in an instant. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Around him, the staff stood taller, no longer bound by fear. Customers shifted in their seats, their eyes wide, some even nodding in quiet approval. Angela inhaled deeply, her chest lifting, as though a weight had finally been removed. For the first time that evening, she felt herself exhale freely. David reached for her hand, steady and strong. He wasn't just removing Richard from his position, he was restoring her dignity, in front of everyone who had watched it be taken away. And as Richard fumbled toward the door, the realization settled in for everyone present. Power, real power, didn't come from cruelty. It came from the courage to choose what was right. For a long, suspended second, no one moved. Richard stood frozen, the words, "You're fired," still echoing in his ears, louder than the clinking glasses, louder than the soft hum of the restaurant lights. His authority, once carried like a weapon, was gone. And without it, he looked smaller somehow, a man stripped of the armor he had hidden behind for too long. Angela, her blouse still damp beneath David's jacket, watched in silence as her tormentor faltered. She had come into this restaurant for something as simple as a meal, never imagining it would become a battlefield for her dignity. And now, as Richard's face shifted from shock to fury to shame, she realized she was seeing something rare. A man being held accountable in the very moment of his cruelty. Richard muttered under his breath, the words too broken to carry weight. He reached for the counter, as if clinging to the last symbol of authority he had left, but no one moved to support him. The staff who once shrank from his glare stood still now, their eyes steady, their bodies firm. They weren't afraid anymore. One young waiter, the same one who had almost stepped forward earlier, took a small, brave step toward Angela. His hands shook, but his voice was soft as he said, "I'm so sorry, ma'am. You shouldn't have been treated that way." Angela looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. Her lips parted, and though she wanted to speak, she found herself nodding instead, the gratitude too heavy for words. Around the room, something shifted. A woman at the corner table gave a small clap, hesitant at first, then firm. Another man joined, then another. Within moments, a wave of soft applause filled the restaurant, not thunderous but steady, like the sound of hearts agreeing all at once. It wasn't applause for the firing, it was applause for the truth, for the courage to say enough. Richard's face burned red. He tried to speak, but the sound was swallowed by the approval building around him. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he turned and stormed toward the door, his footsteps loud and clumsy. The bell above the entrance jangled violently as he pushed his way out, and then he was gone. The applause faded, leaving in its place a silence far different than before. This silence was lighter, almost reverent. David squeezed Angela's hand gently, his thumb brushing over her skin. She looked at him, and in his steady eyes, she found the reassurance she had needed since the moment that soda splashed across her chest. "You are not invisible. You are not alone. You are not less." The staff shifted, waiting for David to speak again, uncertain of what came next. But his attention was only on Angela. He leaned close and whispered just for her, "You don't have to carry this by yourself anymore." Her throat tightened, tears brimming in her eyes. Not from humiliation this time, but from release. Justice, she realized, wasn't always about grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it was quiet, tender, personal. It was in the moment when the cruelty that tried to silence you was named for what it was, and removed. The restaurant had witnessed cruelty, yes, but now they had also witnessed accountability. And that, more than anything, was the lesson that would linger. The restaurant felt different now, as though the very air had shifted. Where moments ago there had been tension so heavy it pressed against every chest, there was now a quiet kind of relief. Richard's absence left behind more than an empty space by the counter. It left behind a possibility, a reminder that cruelty was not untouchable. David stood tall, his hand still holding Angela's. He could feel the eyes of the staff and customers resting on him, waiting. Not because he demanded their attention, but because they had just witnessed something that pierced through the ordinary. They wanted to know what came next. He turned slightly, facing the young servers who lingered behind the counter, their shoulders still tight with uncertainty. His voice, when it came, was calm but steady, filling the space with clarity. "You don't need to be afraid," he said, his gaze moving from face to face. "No one will lose their job for standing up for what's right. Not now, not ever. This company isn't built on fear, it's built on respect. If leadership doesn't reflect that, then it isn't leadership at all." The words sank deep. One by one, the staff straightened, their eyes softening with relief. For years, they had carried the quiet weight of Richard's arrogance, shrinking themselves to survive under his rule. And now, in the span of a single evening, that weight was lifted. David didn't speak long. He didn't need to. Truth, spoken simply, was stronger than any performance. When he fell silent, the room followed. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Angela sat in her chair, David's jacket still wrapped around her, the scent of leather and warmth replacing the stickiness of soda. She looked around the room, at the faces of strangers who had watched her humiliation, at the staff who had once been too afraid to move, at the customers who now carried the memory of what they had seen. For the first time since it happened, she allowed herself to breathe fully. She didn't feel small anymore. She didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. And in that seeing, she found something she hadn't expected, a sense of healing. Because this wasn't just about being married to a CEO. It wasn't about power or titles. It was about dignity, restored in the exact place it had been torn away. Later, when she and David stepped out into the night, the air was cool against her skin, and the city lights glowed softly in the distance. She held his hand tighter, not because she was still shaken, but because she felt grounded, whole. She thought about the staff who had watched Richard fall, about the customers who had applauded, about the lesson etched into every heart in that room. And she knew this truth. Power is not in cruelty. It is not in titles or wealth or fear. Real power lives in the choice to stand up, for yourself, for others, for what is right. As they walked together into the night, the echoes of that truth remained behind in the restaurant, carried silently by everyone who had witnessed it. And Angela Davis, once drenched in humiliation, walked away with something far greater than justice. She walked away with her dignity unbroken,